Do plants communicate to each other? From roots to leaves within individuals or between different plant species? Do plants behave as a collective? In this episode, biologist Dr. Kaz Uyehara talks about how scientists observe plant communication and behavior. Hi, and welcome to In the Swarm, where we dive into the minds behind the hive. I'm your host, Dr. Nexter Smith, and today I'm happy to bring in a very special guest once again, our one and only plant behavior specialist, Dr. Kaz Uyehara. Hi, Kaz.
Hi.
Thanks for being here. Do you want to tell us a bit about yourself, about your journey? How do you end up here at the Collective Behavior Cluster?
Yeah. So I am American, and I grew up going outside and camping and enjoying time in the forest. And then I learned you can actually make a career out of that. And so I am a biologist, and I would say a general biologist who's now specialized in plants. As I got older, I started shifting my focus more and more onto a more quantitative look at plants and studying more theoretical concepts and doing more computer science. But in my heart, I'm still just trying to make it as someone who gets to walk around in the forest.
Can you tell us a little bit about what you're doing here?
Yeah, I'd love to. So here I study the collective behavior of plants. And it's a little bit of a weird idea, I think, because not everyone even necessarily thinks that plants even behave. But I think they behave, and I think they also behave in a collective way. And so I'm trying to study how an individual plant reacts to other plants around it, and also how an individual plant is itself made up of a collection of leaves.
Just now you kind of gave us a general idea of this is what you think plant behavior is. Do you want to go a bit more into details when it comes to that?
Yeah, sure. So when we think about animals behaving, it's usually something quite natural to us, right? Your dog is wagging its tail. You see a deer run across the road because you think it's scared. And so it's very relatable to us because we also behave in ways similar to animals because we're animals. And the general idea of animal behavior is that animals use behavior to interact with their environment, right? This allows them to make new decisions or help them in new environments. If you're in a place with no food, then you behave by maybe migrating to a place with food. A plant is sessile, right? It can't move, but it can behave, right? And so animals pretty much have a set body plan. You know, for us, generally, we have 4 limbs, two ears, 2 eyes, 1 spine, right? The body plan's pretty much fixed. You might be a little taller or smaller, and when you're a baby, you're a lot smaller, but it's pretty much the same. Plants, like what's the body plan of a plant, right? It's not like you can just say, oh, this is what a plant looks like. No, a plant will have, how many leaves does a plant have? Like, I don't know, like 100,000 versus like how many eyes does a human have? It's like usually 2. Mm-hmm. And so if you're a plant, you've traded off, right? You can't move. You can't walk south when it's too cold, right? You have to adapt. Mm-hmm. And if you want to interact in this kind of real-time adaptive way without moving a lot, you can grow. And so whereas an animal might move its body to accomplish some goal, we can think of a plant growing its body as its behavior. And so a plant, we can get the same plant, like same seed, we can clone it and grow it 1,000 different times in different environments, and it will look 1,000 different ways. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that's showing us that plants aren't set like humans are, right? They can adapt to their surroundings. And by doing so, their growth, to me, is their behavior.
Sometimes because you look outside, you're like, yes, it makes sense for these plants to grow as much as possible, but you don't really think why.
We don't see plants on plant timescales.
Right.
Plants live as long or longer than us. And so sometimes for our lifetime, a plant, it's like nothing to them. And so all this stuff is happening on slow timescales and we don't see it. It's not like a lion chasing an antelope. So there's all this behavior happening that we don't get because we're not used to that time scale. Mm-hmm. And so if you watch like a time lapse of 100 years of a forest growth, then I think you start to see, oh, plants are evil. Plants
are evil?
They are trying to kill each other and not be killed.
Oh, wow.
And right, so it's like, oh, I'm in my garden and it's so lovely.
And peaceful.
And there's butterflies and birds and It's so lovely. And like, this is where I go to be calm. But from the plant's perspective, they are locked in this eternal lion chasing antelope chase, right? Their whole life is like that. And I mean, my PhD advisor, Steve Pacala, he, when I first met him, just dropped this one-liner on me, which has kind of directed a lot of my research, which was, well, wood is a weapon.
Oh, God.
And I was like, yeah, right. And again, this is coming from someone who studies plants, right? But even just this one-liner, I was like, right, wood is a weapon. Like, why is there wood? Plants don't have to make wood. A lot of plants don't make wood.
Woods. Right.
And wood it came up at some point evolutionarily that they could make wood.
So why do plants make wood?
Well, it's all about light. When plants are in water, the light is very close to the water surface. And so they can grow very long leaves because water is giving support to their growth and to their structure. And then when they are close to the water surface, they receive a lot of light and they are happy. But when they are out of the water and when they are on land, then the gravity and the wind are playing much bigger roles. And every time a plant tries to grow, then it will fall.
I see. So the wood is actually kind of a structural component of a plant to support it.
Yes, exactly. So over evolutionary times, some tissue in the plant will specialize in a more and more rigid component, and then at some point this will become wood. And so a plant that has wood can grow taller, and by being taller it has better access to light, and it is also creating more shade for the other plants below.
So what happens to these plants then?
Well, they can specialize for low light intensity, but let's find out more from Kaz.
So would you say that your research is centered around the concept of plant competition?
Yes, for
Right.
sure. For sure. And so if we just expand, right, this general idea is like, oh, plants, right, if they fall behind other plants, they might starve to death. Now, again, different plants have had different strategies to deal with this. Some plants are like, okay, I don't want to fight. I just want to chill. I will live in the shade. And so instead of like trying to fight these trees, I'm just going to accept this really low quality food and just try to chill. Totally reasonable strategy. Other plants are like, either I'm going to die getting to the canopy or I'm going to kill everybody else trying to get to the canopy. So I study game theory, which is, you know, in a very general sense, given a game with rules, you know, what's the best strategy? And so when I'm walking around the forest, I'm still enjoying the fresh air, the beautiful sounds, you know, the general ambiance. But there's also a part of me that's constantly looking around me, and it's like observing a chess game. Should I make a branch here or both? If so, which branch should be longer? And then these are all behaviors, right?
Right. The way that you're like, okay, all the plants are like engaged in this battle and like trying to win the chess game. How do they do that?
So there are two different timescales of this process. So one is there's an evolutionary timescale, which is a plant, you know, plants will live and die, and the successful plants will pass on their genes. And so sometimes you're kind of locked into a certain strategy, right? It's the strategy of your ancestors that's been passed down to you. And so in that way, you're not thinking, it's just, you know, I'm going to make leaves that are this long, and that's just how I'm going to roll. And it turns out that that's either going to be good or bad for you. And so that's not really a decision. That's kind of evolution forcing or selecting for certain traits. We can also think on a short time scale, which is given what you know right now, know in air quotes, you're a plant. What do I know? What should I do? That's a very short time scale. You know, that could be on a daily time scale. That's the plant taking in information about its surroundings and reacting. Things that are hard for us to see sometimes. Oh, the plant has like stopped opening its stomata, which are its little mouths that allow it to breathe in and out. It's like, oh, it's too dry. They open their mouth, they're going to get dehydrated. So
they close it.
They're closed, but they're not happy. And yeah, these are all behaviors on short time scales, from the seconds to hours to days or weeks. And yeah, how does a plant make that quote unquote decision if it doesn't think the way we think? That is super interesting to me.
Okay, so if plants really making these seemingly complicated decisions, which leads to certain sets of behavior, how do they do it?
we can think about a plant as a collective of modular organs, right? So it's much less like an animal in that this is my right arm, this is my left arm. And it's much more like Legos or something, right? It's like it's a stick and a leaf, and a stick and a leaf, and a stick and a leaf, and a stick and a leaf. And none of them are privileged. They're all kind of the same. And so they all have kind of very local information, and somehow that local information needs to be integrated so that they can, again, maybe do these sorts of comparisons or maybe react even though that they don't have this local information.
Okay. So would you say there's local integration going on, but not anything like the central nervous system that animals would work with?
For sure, less detailed than a central nervous system. Like
Okay.
the central nervous system is a biological marvel. It's amazing. And, it's also very expensive tissue. And,
Yeah.
plants eat light, and that's where almost all of our energy comes from, right? From the sun at some point. But it's super expensive, and it's kind of out of budget for the plants, right?
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah. Everything goes into wood.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Again, if you think about, plants for terrestrial biomass, it's mostly plants. And out of that, it's mostly wood. And so if you're in this constant fight just to survive and, you're investing in wood just to not die, you don't have leftovers for brains.
Yeah.
But yeah, to answer...
Okay, so how do plants work without brains?
Yeah, so I would say we don't really know. There's not a definitive answer. It's part of what I'm trying to research here. And so we do know that, there are more global or more integrated signals that a plant can pick up on.
Okay.
And so, the very basics like Plant 101 tutorial, most plants, but not all plants, but most plants, leaves get sun. That's where you make all of your energy, your sugar. But remember, you have your roots and maybe your branches, your woody tissue. That needs energy to survive as well. But all the energy is made in the leaves. So that sugar is exported from the leaves to the rest of the plant to kind of feed the factory. And the same with like water. That's taken up by the roots, but it needs to get to the leaves.
Right.
So that's transported up. And so there's tons of plant hormones that are circulating throughout the plant on all sorts of time scales and spatial scales. And so there are ways that, for instance, if there's a lot of stress in the roots, that a signal could go up to the leaves. And this is how it could integrate this, right? This would be a sort of global signal. Like I'm going to tell, as I send water up the leaves, let's tell the leaves, look, first off, we're not having a good time. Like we need to make some changes.
Right.
And vice versa, a signal can be sugar itself. If the leaves are not making a lot of sugar, well, there's not a lot of sugar that gets to the rest of the plant. And again, there are receptors where they will have, again, quote unquote, knowledge about the carbon, the sugar status of the plant or the water status of the plant.
Right. Okay, so I want to talk a bit more about the plant and its surrounding plants, so to speak. So kind of bring it back a little bit to the competition. So we're talking about the local information that plants can get. What kind of local information then can a plant receive to let them know that, hey, there are other plants going on and they are in direct competition with them?
Yeah, great question. This is one of my favorite plant things.
Okay.
So again, we know from the molecular and genetic side that plants have these photoreceptors, and the basic way a photoreceptor works is that there's a molecule or kind of set of molecules that absorb light, which then leads to some downstream reaction. So for example, phototropin absorbs blue light, and this is thought to be the main driver for plants bending, for phototropism. So one of my favorite photoreceptors is phytochrome. And phytochrome is super funny to me because it has two states. And so it absorbs a lot of light, but the way the states convert is mostly through a discrepancy in red light and far red light. So far red light is basically just red light that's redder. It's a little bit longer wavelength than most red light. So on the far side of the red spectrum.
Of the spectrum,
but we can see
right.
it. We can see red light, far red light. What's interesting about far red light is that it pretty much tells the plant if there's other plants around.
Oh.
And this is a little bit subtle.
So how phytochromes can tell plants that there are other plants around?
Yeah, so basically it's this interesting thing that plant does. So when light hits a plant, they actually don't absorb the whole color spectrum, as evident from like plants being green, because it's actually reflecting green. But another thing that, another spectrum that the plant reflects is actually far red light.
So how this is helping the plant to know that there are other plants around?
Yeah, so as Kaz said earlier, basically plants have this photoreceptors called phytochromes that basically can detect whether there's more red light or far red light. So let's say you're a plant under a shade. If that shade is made by like a rock, the rock would absorb most of the spectrum of light, and the plant will basically detect no light hitting it. And in that case, it'll know it's in the shade, and all it has to do is to grow the other direction to get towards the sunlight. In another case, if you're under the shade of a tree, in that case, the tree actually reflects far red, and you as a plant will then detect more far red than red light. And in that case, basically the plant will know there's competition nearby, and it has to grow the other way, but much faster.
Wow, that's such a cool system. Thanks a lot. Let's go back to Nak and Kaz.
So what are the first general results that you can share with us from these sets of experiments?
Well, we already know that these different photoreceptors that I'm trying to manipulate have these consistent effects on plants. We know that changing the light changes plants' behavior, their growth, their metabolism. But it's a different thing to say, okay, what information did the plant receive when we changed the environment, right? So for instance, you could imagine if you're colorblind and we change two colors that you can't distinguish, sure, we change the environment, but not
it doesn't
in a
matter.
way, right, doesn't matter. Or we need to take into account what information does the plant actually get from that change in the environment. And then once we have that, we can start to ask, okay, we changed the environment in this way. This is the information that the plant now has. How did the plant react? And can we figure out how that information caused that reaction? And
so like the mechanism behind.
Exactly.
Okay.
And so it's, again, I'm an ecologist. And so I'm not trying to do the nitty-gritty molecular biology and the genetic experiments, which give you like the really direct mechanism. I'm doing this sort of intermediate set of experiments where I have very detailed knowledge of what we changed in the environment with artificial light, what I think the plant got out of that, and what the plant did. And so I create simple mathematical models that represent some of that underlying physiology. And it turns out, so far at least, that pretty much works.
Okay.
Right? And this is a bit it's a bit cheating, right? Because the animal version of this is like, there is an animal here. These are the animals around it. You know, what's it going to do next? Super hard to answer. Now, the great thing with the plants and growing them in isolation, but tricking them is, okay, we've taken out all of the variation from the neighbors. We control the neighbors. But also, we don't have to deal with all of the complex things that animals do. Right. So in the most basic way, again, the plant bending towards more light. We've known about this for a super long time. We have a basic understanding of the photoreceptors and some of the hormonal interactions. I make a very simple model of how I think that works. And it turns out it can pretty much predict what a plant does in these different light conditions.
Yeah, mainly it's based on the fact that I guess plant behavior repertoire is a lot more limited than animals or humans, like range of behavior and all the interactions that, you know, comes with having neighbors and not having neighbors and everything that goes on. Okay.
Exactly. And, you know, there's two sides to the coin, right? On one side, some of the most kind of impressive or, you know, humanly interesting behaviors are these super complicated and nuanced behaviors, which I also love. But there's some kind of elegance to the simplicity of a plant. And plants are also super complicated. We are very far from solving plants. But that simplicity allows us to look at these deeper questions, right? This very fundamental, what exactly are plants responding to? Why do they respond to it in that way? Are much easier to tackle in a plant system than in an animal system, just because the problem is a bit simpler.
Yeah, and you're able to really treat, like, quotations, one individual plant as a collective, right?
That too. I mean, I think that part makes it harder, honestly.
Yeah?
Yeah. If plants had brains, the math would be more black boxy, right?
Right.
We're very far in in very simple models, we're getting there with, okay, what chemical changed what neuronal behavior, which caused what whole animal behavior. We're getting there, but certainly not for complex behaviors. And so, that's a hard problem. But on the other hand, if you say, okay, well, they have a brain and they figure out which side's brighter, and then they go there, you kind of say, well, I don't really know how they do it, but I know that they can do it, so I assume that they do it. And for a plant, it's like, well, they do it, but how do they do it? And you can't just say, well, they have a brain and the brain figures it out. No, you have to start looking at, okay, what are the local interactions? What's the local information? How do the hormones travel? And only then can you really get to this kind of deeper mechanism.
Yeah.
So on one hand, it's harder because I think you should really aim to show the physiological process. On the other hand, brains are super complicated. So I'm glad I don't have to deal with figuring out the brain.
Well, saying that to a psychologist.
Yeah, I do not envy you.
No, but I mean, in a way, it's still super interesting, right? You can look at something like behavior that we recognize in everyday life. We behave, and we're saying now that plants also behave, but it's derived from such a different system organization. And that's so cool to me. Okay, so we've more or less established that plants compete. Is diversity important in this context?
Yeah, great question. This really goes back to the game theory framing of evolutionary research.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, some of my very early work was on plants that are adapted to fire, for instance. And so the logic in the past was, okay, we know that some plants are put energy in to being adapted to fire. Doesn't it make sense that if they could, they would make fires more likely?
Oh, so really forest fires.
Yeah. And if you think about fires and plants, well, what do you need for a fire? Oxygen, check. Something that burns, aka wood,
check.
And then something to ignite it. Lightning, campfires. Some plants do well after fire and some don't. If a plant could, all else equal, make fires more likely, shouldn't it if it likes fire?
To eliminate competition,
right,
in a way.
And so this is a completely reasonable frame and logic, but it's wrong. So if you're a plant and you have invested energy into doing well after fires or doing well during fires, then it does make sense that if you could make a fire or make fires more likely, then you would. And so this was an interesting hypothesis, in the last century. And it initially got a lot of traction, kind of passes the general logic, right? But if you think about it a little bit more, and this is what other people did shortly after this hypothesis, it doesn't quite make sense. And that's because species as a concept, very rarely is it species competing against other species. Really, we're talking about individual plants living in an individual place with individual plants around. And it's not like there's this, it's not like you're playing a team sport, right?
Right.
And so it would make sense if all of these individuals of this species got together and said, you know what? Let's make more fires. We're going to destroy these other species and then we'll be better off. And that would be true. But it's a little bit trickier to get that to evolve, right? So if you think, okay, if the first individual of this species says, okay, I'm going to make my leaves super flammable. Well, it turns out that if you did that, I mean, again, the kind of basic logic would go, okay, there's more likely going to be a fire next to this tree. And all the other trees of the same species who didn't do that, well, they're probably going to be safer than that one tree who's like taking one for the team. And if that were some genetic mutation, it's very hard to get that to evolve without some other extra steps.
Right.
And so those extra steps exist in my mind. Again, you need to go a little bit further, that an individual, it has to benefit an individual, right? And so when we think about, okay, how does diversity play into this? There's a couple key aspects, right? One, different species can have different strategies, but in the end, the strategies have to make sense for individuals.
You already know that plants are not technically team players in the local spatial sense, I suppose?
Yeah, this is a super active area of research. And plants are a great example of this because, again, they're a little bit easier. We can go to a forest and measure and name every single tree and come back every year and do it. For animals, you can do it, but it's a little bit harder than, walking in the forest with a tape measure and, some notebooks. And so a very active research in plant ecology is, why is there diversity in plants and how does that affect it? And so this is a fundamental ecological question. Why isn't there just one plant that does everything better than all the other plants? And that's the plant we get. Why are there more plants in some areas of the world than others, right? It's a very, very fundamental question. And they all ultimately do loop back to this individual and competition perspective, but there's a lot of nuance there, right? As a plant, you're changing your local environment. And if other plants of other species have different responses to the local environment you create, there's sometimes more complementarity. Sometimes it might even be beneficial. So if different plants respond differently to the environmental conditions that, a larger plant or a neighboring plant makes, then we have the groundwork for different species performing differently depending on the diversity, or their neighborhood diversity at least. And there's for sure evidence of this. Now, the nitty gritty of it is very subtle and, it's still an active area, but ultimately, we know that there are some plants that actually do better when they're living with another plant. If you've already decided, look, I'm gonna live in low light, that's cool. I'm not gonna try to reach the canopy, and you get full direct sunlight, you might not be prepared for that. That might damage you. Or if you're in a very dry area, you might not want extra sun. You have too much sun. So a little shade's actually going to benefit. And there's all sorts of complicated or indirect effects as well. How does an individual plant change the soil properties of the soil that they're all sharing? And all of this can ultimately affect, which plants live in which community.
When it comes to plant behavior in action, what can listeners do at home to observe or maybe even experiments on plants around them, whether that be trees that they see outside or the house plants that they have at home, amassed in huge quantities after the pandemic?
Yeah, great question. For me, and this is someone with a biology background who even studied plants, I still had this eureka where I was like, oh, maybe I should think about plants from this perspective. And that alone has brought a lot of richness to my interaction with plants. And so from the very mundane, you're driving and observe on your trip how the trees are changing, maybe the species, or maybe even, when they're starting to drop their leaves. And, this is kind of like background information to us. But if you just say, oh, I wonder why that is, basic ecology question. And then on top, you can say, is this smart? Is this competitive? What advantage does this confer to the plant? Does it? What are the trade-offs? Like, what does it mean to drop your leaves too early or too late? And with your house plants, why does this plant need more water than this plant? Is it because they're different species? Is it because they have different strategies? And just this richness, this additional layer of looking at the world through this other lens, I think is super fun. Anytime you can look at something and be like, wow, the world is cool, huh? Wow, wood is a weapon. Wow, cool.
Yeah, I would love that to be the takeaway. So last question, Kaz. What excites you about the natural world?
Yeah, I love the natural world. I love technology as well, but the thing that, really motivates me is seeing beauty in the world. You can find beauty in a lot of places, but the natural world keeps on giving. And the more I think about the plant, the more beautiful it is to me. It's like chess is beautiful. If you study chess and you watch a master chess player, it's beautiful. And just, forest air is also very nice. But, if you not only respect the aesthetic beauty of plants or environments, but
respect
also
the hustle as well.
Yeah,
right?
For sure. Respect the years of evolution that gave us this form and the maybe years of growth that this individual plant in its fight for survival has grown, right, has given us. And so anytime I can step back and appreciate something that's around us a little more, that's extra for me.
Well, thank you so much. It's been such an honor, and it's been super fun to get to hear you talk about your competing, your struggling, and your surviving beautifully plants. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Bye, guys.